Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming. It's great to see that this event has had a lot of interest from people. We are now joined by over 100 plus people online as well. So it's great to see that there's a lot of appetite to discuss what is unfolding. So today we're hosting the event Urbicide and the Horizons of City Remaking. My name is Catalina Ortiz. I'm the director of UCL Urban Laboratory. Our mission is to inquire creatively, collaboratively, and critically into urgent urban problems. That is why, for us, it is an imperative to engage with the unfolding Urbicide, domicide, and ecocide in Palestine and beyond. We are here with a heavy heart and the unbreakable determination to advocate for spatial justice, territorial healing, and liberation. The unspeakable brutality, unprecedented loss of life, social harm, and catastrophic damage implicate us all. Grasping the impact of violence on cities is crucial to understand the contemporary urban condition and the possibilities for spatial justice. Over the past year, the Gaza Strip has been transformed into a landscape of debris and grief, and more recently, the escalation of destruction in Lebanon is following a similar trajectory. Along with has been recognized by the International Court of Justice, Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International as a plausible case of genocide, is the destruction of physical urban space and the erasure of social networks, communal spaces, and collective memory of its residents. This shows how the violence of colonial regimes and imperial projects are relentlessly ruining vast landscapes and imposing ideologies of death. And even though this event focuses on the systematic and deliberate destruction of housing and massive damage to infrastructure in cities in the Middle East, this debate is relevant to all places that are shaped by forces that rely on racialized exploitation, dispossession, and militarization, as well as it operates as a learning site of spatial emancipatory practices to disrupt the unbearable violence of the hegemonic world order that is manifested in our urban environment. In this panel, the speakers will give us a regional and temporal perspective of what can be learned about the calamity that we witness in Gaza and other places, that have experienced Urbicide in Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. They will trace experiences of resistance to spacio-cide and attempts to generate life-affirming infrastructures to allow for the remaking, revival, and restoration of urban life, and home in the broadest definition. So we hope to also discuss what are the visions beyond humanitarian reconstruction or security control urban spaces. So with me today, Dr. Musna Al-Masri is going to be co-chairing the event, and we have the privilege to have a great lineup of speakers, and we are very grateful to join us today, despite it's a very, very difficult moment for everyone. And yet they've been so kind and generous to be sharing with us, particularly in a moment that, you know, everyone is really, really struggling. But we see that it's important and it's an imperative to be here sharing, you know, the experience and also create a little bit of safe space of solidarity as well. So I will introduce briefly our speakers, and then we are going to start by the presentation of the people that are joining us online. Then we will move with our guests that are in person. Afterwards, we're going to have a space for Q&A. We're going to get some of the questions from the room, and then we're going to proceed to get some of the questions from the online sphere. So we hope, because we are starting a little bit late, maybe we're going to be moving the end time, but hopefully you can bear with us. So we have Professor Nurhan Abuiji, and I'm pronouncing badly this name, I'm sorry. She's the head of the Smart Urban Redesign Research Center at the Zuid University of Applied Science in the Netherlands. She is the author of Urbicide in Palestine, the Spaces of Oppression and Resilience. We also have, she's joining us online, Abir Saksuksaso. She's an architect, urbanist, and co-founder of Public Works, and they've been leading kind of public debate in Lebanon and supporting advocacy around equitable cities and urban governance. And in person, we have Dr. Amar Asus. He's a British Academy Research Fellow from the University of Oxford, and he recently has published around domicide, architecture, war, and destruction of home in Syria, and also has written a very enlightening editorial of the erased city in the journal City. And also we have our colleague and peer, Dr. Sana Mourani, that is an associate professor in spatial practice with a background in architecture and urban design. She works in University of Plymouth. She recently also have published a beautiful book that is called Rupturing Architecture, Spatial Practices of Refuge and Response to War and Violence in Iraq from 2003 to 2013. And she leads a very important project from HRC about Rupture Atlas, creative mapping, home displacement and migration and return. So without further ado, I want to give the space for our first speaker. So Nurhan, I'm going to try to share the slides and maybe we can hopefully make this work.
Thank you, Catalina. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this important discussion today. And though we have very short time for our presentations, but I hope in the Q&A session we can elaborate more on some of the themes we are discussing. We witness every day on our, like since 1 year, as Catalina mentioned, we see on our social media or TV these types of images. Maybe you can click on the videos, Catalina, please. That this tremendous scale of destruction in Gaza that is not only tackling the physical urban fabric, the infrastructure, the everyday life, but it also extends its impacts collective memory, people's experience of trauma, this loss of sense of what was once home, with all the history, culture, and memories of people that are hosted in this physical environment. Maybe next, Catalina. And this is actually the question that I wanted today to answer. What are the impacts of these events of political ecologies with focus on military urbanism and architecture of resistance? Because we architects and urbanists normally want to celebrate cities as locations of the glory of civilizations, and we shy away from understanding and looking and researching and investigating the cities while they collapse in events of warfare or colonial context. And this is why my research for 20 years on Urbicide is materializing in the book, but also now in this presentation. Next. So Urbicide in Palestine, and as we can see, like in all events of war, the destruction is normally justified as collateral damage or damage for security reason, for the simple reason to escape any legal consequences, and actually to justify that this destruction is needed. Since the 90s and the Bosnian War, so many discourses emerged to understand and to capture these events of political ecologies, from spacio-cide, memory side, ecocide, identity side, spacio-cide, and of course, Urbicide, that I find it more capturing the Palestinian case. So Urbicide is the murder or the intentional destruction of the urban territories. And normally Urbicide doesn't happen in vacuum. It goes hand in hand with other forms of political violence, such as ethnic cleansing, genocide, ecocide, or a memory side. Next. Now going back to the Palestinian case, so Urbicide in Palestine, we need to know that this is not only happening since 1 year. Next. We need to understand that the destruction of the Palestinian urbanity started at the end of the 19th century with the creation of the Zionist movement, with their doctrines, the Judenstaat, which is how to create an exclusive Jewish state in the historic land of Palestine. Next. By promoting Palestine as an empty land that needs to be, civilized and then revitalized by this Jewish state. And we can see here that Palestine was not empty. It had a nation living there. Next. So since its inception, the Zionist movement established this matrix of control by developing different tactics, strategies to control the land and its people. And invasion and destruction is only part of that. I'm so I am sick. And now we will see how this intentional destruction of cities is taking place in Palestine. Next. So herbicide by destruction, by actual destroying cities and villages starting from the 1948, where 500 cities and villages were destroyed. Sorry, give me 1 second. In the western parts of Palestine to give a place for the Jewish state to emerge. And this is what we are now witnessing in Gaza. So the actual destruction of urbanity. Next. What are the characteristics of herbicide? It should be really a widespread or total damage and destruction inflicted on the setting. In Gaza, we witness, at least till now, with the statistics that we have, over 250,000 housing units were destroyed. All the universities and around 346 schools in Gaza are also destroyed. So the destruction is taking place not only on the housing, but it's infrastructure, it is the landscape, agricultural land, name it. So it's the whole territory is under destruction. And that's why it can be entitled as an herbicide case. Next. There is another form of herbicide, which is herbicide by design and construction. Destroying the Palestinian place to make a space for the Israeli space and identity and culture to emerge. Since the Sharon's project of settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories, we can see how all these settlements are placed on strategic locations to overlook the Palestinian urbanity and also to hinder the possibility of any urban development of the Palestinian cities. Also, the housing demolition policies in the occupied territories, of course, including Gaza, is also a witness of this type of herbicide by destruction and construction. Next. Another form is this infrastructure that is established across the occupied territories by the Jewish-only highways that can also help in confiscating more Palestinian land for to be under Israeli control. And the apartheid wall is a very important witness of how the Palestinian urbanity and the Israeli urbanity is separated to make sure that this Jewish identity is celebrated and flourishing in the western parts of historic Palestine. The checkpoints, of course, and the surveillance and control apparatus along also the Palestinian infrastructure that enclaves and put all the Palestinian cities and villages in a continuous siege. So all movements and mobility is under the Israeli control. So accessing a hospital, a university, going to school becomes a very difficult task and sometimes can take so many hours for the Palestinians. Next. It's amazing how much this apartheid is also projected in the Israeli regulations and laws that can also identify who can have access to what in terms of election rights, accessibility to services, And this is also presented on the different colors of and the codes in the ID system, where residents in Gaza, the West Bank, and Jerusalem, and in Israel have different identity cards, colors. Next. In every big war that we witness in the past century and this century, for example, the invasion of Iraq, there is a systematic campaign and propaganda that is a machine that is projecting is a way to justify this place destruction by demonizing and dehumanizing that place before it is destroyed. And this is a quote from a general of the American forces that invaded Fallujah. He says that the enemy has got a face. He's called Satan. He is in Fallujah, and we are going to destroy him. So this nihilism of the Satan terrorist and his habitat is justified and is perceived as a necessity act of purification, cleansing of this cancerous danger. Next. We witness similar propaganda before and till now during the invasion of Gaza and the war on Gaza by projecting the Palestinians as human animals, as the terrorists, attacking the terrorists or uprooting the Palestinian terrorists. And this is how to put the Palestinian people outside any juridical or legal aspects, and the purification of their habitat and killing them is justified, and as actually it is a needed act. Next. This is not only in Gaza, it is a systematic projection of the Palestinian subject as less worthy outside any human norms and regulations. And we could see that during the many Israeli governments that took place in the past decades. Next. The most important is not only the physical destruction of the urban fabric and the infrastructure, but it is the impact of this destruction that entitles also Urbicide. So how this destruction causes this sense of loss and tragic experience and leaves significant impacts on the inhabitants' recognition of self, place, and the other. So if we see now, till now, I think these are more the official statistics, and I don't like to talk about people by statistics, but if we see now at least 16,000 children are killed, and it is still ongoing process. I am now in Delft in the Netherlands. This number actually encompasses all the primary school children in this city, just to understand the tremendous scale of killing. Next. So also the destruction transforms not only the urban form of the city, but also its meaning and perception. So if we look at the children of Gaza who are now experiencing the fifth wars. So imagine that we are now calling them the fifth wars generation. Nearly 25,000 children in Gaza are now orphans. Many of them are nameless and unaccompanied, and they are now registered under the acronym Wounded Child, No Surviving Family. What would be the future of these children? Just imagining also this scale of trauma and impact on the population. Next. During all these four wars, of course, many psychologists also work with the kids just to understand how these children experience. And this is an example of all these art workshops, how the children experience or imagine their territory, but also how they are perceiving the Israeli. He is only the military soldier who is coming here just to destroy and kill and loot their land. So these destruction events have tremendous impacts on people's collective memory and how they are seeing their own cities and urbanity, which is called by Sarah Mehraj as identitycide. Next. I will end with this slide. I'm sorry I didn't really elaborate on the theme because we didn't have time. But for me, I think this is a platform that at least to highlight and put the urgency to discuss and keep talking about Palestine, to lend our voice to the 2 million people who are now silenced by this continuous destruction and killing. And we need also to see during the discussion, how can we help? How can we lend them a hand, not only a voice? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Abir, and I'm going to speak on behalf of Public Works. I'm going to present the work we've been doing since a year now on documenting and mapping the Israeli attacks on Lebanon. But I'm going to start with 3 testimonies or 3 messages I received on WhatsApp from my family members on the 23rd of September, so exactly a month ago. This is our neighbor's house in Deir Zahrane. It's 80 years old. Apparently, it's military infrastructure, when even a sewage system it doesn't have. This is our cousin's house in Hanaway, where 8 people were killed, 4 of whom were children. I don't understand why it was targeted. I really don't. This is my shop on the main street of Zreriye. They destroyed the whole street from the first moment. They left nothing. So these are 3 testimonies from family members sent on the 23rd of September, a month ago, a day that will be very difficult to forget, when 600 people were killed by Israeli warplanes in one day, causing a huge wave of sudden and mass displacement from the south of Lebanon, hitting a world record with the bloodiest day in the 21st century. During that week, in total, the Israeli occupation targeted 247 towns across Lebanon. Since then, the southern suburb of Beirut, or what I'd like to call simply Beirut, has been subjected to daily Israeli bombings. Under the pretext of protecting civilian lives, the Israeli army designated certain buildings in Beirut using aerial maps as potential targets and published them only minutes before carrying out the attacks. This is a sample of the tweets they would put out on a daily and hourly basis. And of course, these threats and tweets aim to say that the Israeli army is conducting precise attacks. Yet if we see all the threats cumulatively, we can see that they are extremely dense, they are a city-scale condition, and that they are resulting in the erasure of entire fabrics, places, neighborhoods, especially that the actual attacks almost always go beyond the designated threats. In fact, since the beginning of the Israeli genocide in Gaza, Lebanon has not been spared from Israeli attacks. So from October 8, the attacks were ongoing on Lebanon. International media was not covering, and the Lebanese state itself was not acknowledging that we are in a state of war. Until February 2024, more than 100,000 persons had been displaced from towns in South Lebanon, many having lost their source of livelihood. And by October 14, 2024, the number of martyrs had reached a total of 2,500, along with 10,700 injured persons, according to the Lebanese Ministry of Health. The number of displaced persons between 23 September to this date is estimated to be 1.2 million people, comprising a total of 22% of Lebanon's population. In response, and since October 8, 2024, Public Works has been recording the bombardment on Lebanon and has been mapping them according to the types of weaponry, the number of bombardment days, and the types of targets inflicted. The map can be read on several levels. It can be visited on this link. It's an interactive map, so it can be read through time or geography or type of bombing or type of target. Using our documentation tools, we consider this mapping a political act. It has enabled us to track and document these attacks, to understand their cumulative impact on our built and natural environment and on our lives as residents. We have been doing this mapping based on daily media monitoring and monitoring of testimonies and videos posted on social media. More recently, the Lebanese state has been also documenting these, so we have been complementing our sources from the government. On one level, this mapping has enabled us to document the ecocide being committed by Israel, meaning the deliberate destruction of the environment and its natural and agricultural resources. Incendiary bombs have caused devastating and long-term environmental damage, not just within towns, but also in the forests and agricultural lands sustaining them, contaminating water and soil, threatening fauna and flora, and therefore having a long-term impact on people's cultural and physical existence. In fact, more than 8 million square meters of land in South Lebanon have been burned, causing huge economic losses for farmers. And as I said, this hasn't been happening in the past month. This has been happening for the past year. Israel has conducted 139 white phosphorus attacks, which is the internationally prohibited substance that causes long-term effects, harming biodiversity. And this has always been used as a tactic as part of war and colonial tactics. And when looking at these attacks and overlaying them with aerial photography and maps of agriculture and biodiversity, this is the example of Farkila. We see the consistency. So the fires, the incendiary bombs, and the phosphorus attacks were happening in areas of high biodiversity and agriculture. This has, of course, prohibited farmers from reaching their land, and it was in the first few months one of the main causes for displacement. I didn't have time to translate this into English, but if we look at the frequency of the phosphorus attacks, we see that the Israeli army used phosphorus extensively during the first 5 months, so from October to 2023 to February to January 2024. Starting February, the timeline shows that the number starts to increase, while actually the rate of bombing of neighborhoods and homes began to escalate. And maybe we should have known back then that this is an indication towards a shift in strategy, towards exercising more control over the civilian population and to cause greater displacement. The documentation and the mapping of attacks as such has also enabled us to speak about domicide being committed by Israel as a war crime. While international law outlaws all forms of arbitrary destruction of housing and arbitrary displacement and forced eviction, we see that this has been happening through gross violations without any intervention of the international community. The only statement that happened was by the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Housing on 27 September past month, where he says that Israel is committing domicide in Lebanon, erasing entire residential blocks, and so on. As of October, actually, 303 towns have now been targeted by Israeli bombardments. The bombardment recently started targeting entire towns. So, for example, it targeted the border town of Mhaibib, wiping it entirely off the map in a deliberate act of Urbicide, documented through video by the Israeli army itself and spreading it along with aerial footage. You can see here in the map that around 300 buildings have been flattened entirely in 3 towns, Haibib, Blida, and Maisel Jabal, as a result of using detonation. This is today in the southern city of Tyr. This is an image also of what the Israeli army put out as a threat of what they intend to attack. And you can see, like in the red, it's an entire portion of the city. They're not even talking anymore about individual buildings. And of course, such threats have led to traumatic evacuations whenever possible and the subsequent displacement of thousands, many of whom have fled on foot, seeking refuge in public areas in Beirut, some remaining on the streets until today. In fact, the number of displaced persons today, as I mentioned before, has become 1,300,000, constituting 22% of Lebanon's population. From these, only 120,000 have been formally registered in shelters provided by the government. While the Lebanese government did approve a national emergency plan back in November 2023, but it was in total denial that we're actually in a state of war. The plan has been ineffective and questioned. It lacks a comprehensive approach to adequate shelter, neglects the rights of and needs of many portions of society, and discriminates against non-Lebanese. And today, with the expansion of the war and the devastating scale of displacement, the government plan has proven to be ineffective, as entire towns were evacuated without an evacuation plan nor guidance. Shelters provided by the government were run down, not equipped, without any electricity or water, and rental prices skyrocketed. As a result, and due to inadequate shelter solutions, many have ended up on the streets, while facing crackdown by security forces and forced evictions from the street and the closure of all public parks to not allow displaced persons in. This is particularly in Beirut, actually. And on the other hand, and in the lack of solutions, many residents have sought refuge by squatting vacant buildings. And to give some context, 25% of Beirut's housing units are vacant. In these squatted buildings, residents have attempted at remaking life temporarily by organizing themselves, collecting common resources, renovating the rundown buildings, connecting them with water and electricity, only to be faced a few days or weeks later by police aggression, evicting them in the defense of private property. So in short, the Israeli ongoing and escalating aggression has been causing widespread devastation, claiming lives, destroying homes, infrastructure, and even harming the environment and destroying the economy even more. In fact, Lebanon's urban environment has been substantially shaped and reshaped by the destructive influences of past Israeli wars and post-war reconstruction policies. And while we were renovating ourselves each time after each crisis and after the many critical moments in our history, Lebanon today is experiencing the multiple threats of military attacks, of failed government, and of financial collapse. In a time that can be considered one of the country's most devastating eras. So it remains to be seen if we will be able to recover this time around. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, for those in person, and thanks also for those who are with us online, Abir and Nurhan, also sending my thoughts and prayers to you and your loved ones in these painful times. I'm briefly going to speak a little bit about my research on cities and violence for the next 10 minutes by reading a little bit of text that I have written about my country, Syria, which I left in 2011 without ever being able to return. So there's this form of the aftermath of war. What does it feel like? Even when the bulldozers are no longer erasing your homeland, the pain will remain for years to come. And even when the drones are out of the skies, the trauma will live with you. Even when the bombs will stop being targeted at your homes, your bakery shops, your schools, your hospitals, your suffering continues. The pain, trauma, and suffering unfold and live with you, even when the news media will forget you. They turn you from the news headlines into a footnote in history. They turn your story into numbers, but we are not numbers. I have seen this in my country, Syria. Our pain was in the news every day. Our bodies in pieces, filmed to show the world what is happening to innocent civilians. Our architecture, as you see on the screen, but also those of ancient heritage of thousands and hundreds of years old have turned into rubble in minutes and weeks and months. The next slide, please. The brutal destruction of cities has been normalized, sadly, tragically. We live in a time where one city after the other is being brutally destroyed at the time of war, but also sometimes in quote unquote at the time of peace. Civilians and their architecture are not on the side of battlefields, but they are also the target. Let's look at Kharkiv in Ukraine, for instance, Aleppo in Syria, Mosul in Iraq, Beirut in Lebanon, or Gaza in Palestine, and see the massive scale of destruction and the monumental number of displaced millions of people around these countries who are displaced from their homes. It all reminds us of all the cities that were destroyed before them in many, many countries, including our own very city where we are sitting today, London. So I just wanted to put this photo as a reminder of our beautiful city here. Whilst destroyers label their killings and destruction as precise or collateral damage, as we heard from Abir and also Nurhan, or part of what destroyers and the armies would be calling as a war on terror, we have seen that the lives of millions of civilians are shaped by the settlement and the actions of these destroyers. As Liz Luzate, the BBC's chief international correspondent, noted in the foreword of my book Domicide, which I published last year, she said that wars of our time, sometimes fought in our name, are not in the trenches. They are fought street to street, house to house, one home after the other. Why does a hospital, a kindergarten, always seem to be hit in every outbreak of hostilities? She also notes that after nearly 4 decades of reporting on conflict, I now often say that civilians are not close to the front lines, they are the front line. In my country that has been turned into a forgotten war, over 14 million people have been displaced since the start of the Syrian revolution in 2011. That was March in 2011. Of these 14 million people, over 7.2 million people are internally displaced inside their country. Sometimes they are as displaced as many 20 times in these last 14 years. And the rest of us are scattered around the world, mostly in neighboring countries such as Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, but also beyond in Germany, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and like myself in the UK. In my city, Homs, the third largest city, half of the neighborhoods have been destroyed. It is estimated that over 500,000 people in Syria have been killed since 2011, but even the UN has stopped counting after they counted 306,000 killings, noting that, and I quote them, the situation in the country grows more complex and dangerous. So how do we live after that? Why do we write at the time of destruction, and why do we research when there is a massacre? Why do we make a painting like the work of Tim Talah, who's a Syrian artist based in France? Why do we publish a novel when millions of people are displaced? And as many of us here might be from the university, what is our role as students, researchers, and lecturers at the time of war? We search for a meaning, we document the horrors of war, we remember, we collectively heal, we try to live a life even when the worlds collapse, even when we live in a storm of images and a flood of footage of violence, destruction, and killing. To borrow the words of Dr. Nadi Abu Saida, who is a Jerusalem-born architect and writer, he said that amid the harrowing scenes of carnage, finding adequate words becomes an onerous task. Historians of the lived environments in Palestine often find ourselves bound to document destruction rather than construction. There are also other histories to narrate about our cities, additional stories waiting to be told. Yet the relentless Israeli colonial violence against our land and people, the pace of erasure suppresses that of history writing. The bulldozer is faster than the pen. Many academics and students today struggle to put words together as we watch an unfolding destruction of cities, as we witness the constant erasure of buildings and the rapid writing and rewriting of history. As Dr. Mizna Kato, a fellow at the University of Cambridge says, historians of Palestine often note how much harder it is to write a history of Palestine after the Nakba than a history of Palestine before it. A people scattered, isolated under siege, bombarded, repeatedly massacred and dispossessed has meant that the generations of Palestinians must rely on shards and scraps, 1,000 archival projects everywhere. But people keep writing, we keep teaching, and we keep creating new archives. The world is listening, and a new generation of scholars are building on the struggle that seemed to connect us all to arrive to a justice and freedom. Check out on each other, reach out to academics in war zone, provide scholarship to displaced communities, ask your Lebanese students how they are, and bring the voices of those impacted by violence, wars, and dictatorships to your teaching. I'm really grateful for Catalina, Mizna, and the organizers for bringing us today together, bringing these struggles that are intertwined and connected because the pain in one. Beirut is only 90 kilometers from Damascus. Gaza is only 300 kilometers from Beirut. Amman is 65 kilometers from Jerusalem. Gaza is 324 kilometers from Cairo. Borders that are shaped by occupations and colonial powers want us to see that our cities are separate and distant from each other. They are not, because our pain is one. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for being with us, and thank you, Norhan and Abir and Ammar, for this. This is an extension of exactly that one pain, one struggle. As I see it, my work is situated in Iraq, which is where I come from, and I have been also subjected to all kinds and sorts of violence and war. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the work that I've been doing, which has become part of a book that has just recently been published. Rupturing architecture, and the book really discusses quite a lot of things, so I'm not going to get into exactly what we can do. Thank you. Yeah, and then folks go. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, perfect. So this is really just to give a very quick overview of this is where when I grew up in the 80s. I was born in the 70s, but the extension of destruction and trauma extends beyond that. In fact, it became a part of that colonial history. Iraq was colonized by Britain in 1920. And it was an extension of that we continue to be sort of an epicenter of this violence that continues to happen across that region. On the other side, so I work with maps, and I will talk to you a little bit about how I do things, but this is a very complex map of Iraq. Iraq is not only partners and in the center of that part of the world, but it's also has its own political pressures. Kurdistan region leads a big part of this and wants to have independence, and also the south, which is dominated by Shia, and also the proxy war with and the relationship with Iran. So I focus in my work on trying to find places of refuge within all of this mess of trauma and violence. And the work that I did was working with 15 Iraqis across Iraq, so this is from the north to the south, to really understand how they coped through a period of 20 years past the 2003 invasion. But this doesn't really, it didn't stop, and it's not stopping either. We went through several wars from that period, but also a civil war and a full-on, complete and utter a bloodbath of insurgency, followed by ISIS, and a genocide in the north of Iraq. So there has been a repeated, which I call this protracted version of spatial violence across. But my work deals with that relationship between how people and places come together to start to understand those or respond to those spaces of violence. I work with maps, but I do counter maps. So this is not based on anything other than accounts by people telling their stories. And I bring this in a collapsed kind of version. So there's a lot of layering that I do in my work. And I use these words, rupture and refuge, to really make a kind of that relationship between how we as architects, potentially also planners and urbanists, very much responsible to a lot of breaking and making. We have to break to make something. So I work with this idea of rupture in a duality of kind of the breaking of things, but also the making of other things that come from that, and the placemaking that happened through that trauma. In the book, I deal with quite a lot of scales within, and the scales don't just stay in one place, as we heard from across the speakers today. It's not just about the home, it's not just about the identity, it's not just about the city. It kind of collapses and goes between those. So I work through all of those spaces. And I'm not going to dwell a lot on this because I want to get to the what versions of Urbicide manifested in Iraq. And I did mention that I work with those creative deep mapping kind of processes. So we had lots of versions of Urbicide, and it started with a silent Urbicide. This is the killing of cities without doing anything, without actually breaking the earth. This is just triggering a trauma of a previously existed genocide that happened in the 80s in the north of Iraq. And I worked with people, individuals who have come out of that space, understanding how Iraqis dealt with it throughout that part of history. We also had horizontal Urbicide, so this is really how ISIS, it really used exactly what IDF has been doing in West Bank and the Palestinian villages and cities, going through houses, not door to door, not through the urban grain, but actually through the houses, breaking everything within that. And that Urbicide is intentional because it doesn't only break the fabric of the city, but it's also breaking the existence of that human connection within the city. And we also have quite a lot of World Heritage sites that got vandalized and destroyed as part of that. So there is a particular cultural memory that has been erased, and it's not. Those events don't just happen and go; they happen and repeatedly keep happening, even to the same buildings. We also had vertical Urbicides. When Iraq went through civil war after the collapse of the regime, after the invasion in the early 2000s, what happened is the Shia and the Sunni part of the country went into a complete collide with each other. And as a result, there were lots of blast walls littering that part. And in fact, afterwards, when I was tracing where those blast walls ended, they ended up being shipped to Israel. so that they can use them across Palestine. So there is this protracted layer of suffering that comes and happens in different places. I've just completed a project, which was that funded project through the AHRC on ruptured atlas. I worked with survivors of genocide from the Yazidi genocide in the north of Iraq at the hands of ISIS. Exactly the same patterns of herbicide, domicide, all kinds of side, ecocide, as well as every aspect of it, and genocide that we're seeing now and witnessing over the past year in Gaza happened in that one small part of the north of Iraq. And I worked with those survivors to document how they coped over the past 10 years. Just to give you an idea, 2.5 million people in the north of Iraq, just in the north of Iraq, were displaced, forcibly displaced, still internally displaced, still in camps. And this has been going on for decades. Ecocide is a big one, but it's also a more recent one that started to happen in Iraq. So you see these are date palm trees. Iraq is known for a variety of different date palm trees. And in fact, they say that there is one for every single person, a variety in Iraq. And there is 45 million Iraqis in Iraq. And what was really interesting is to see how these were the deforestation happened in order to change the function of certain parts of cities so that they can start building other things on them, usually not planned or connected to the rest of the city and plan. I want to end on a big and a very important moment, and I am very biased. This has been an incredible year for Iraq. In 2019, it had its full-on revolution, which was incredibly peaceful and one of the most creative responses to state violence that ever happened in that part of the world. And I mean Iraq, because I know that it also reverberated, but also there were other Tishreen movements happening across the Middle East and before that. But the 2019 showed that there is resilience in that and the creative aspect of responding to this violence and trauma in the country. And I document this as a case study in the book. As one of the ways that the city is starting to kind of build back after all of the genocide. I end the book with a manifesto of spatial justice, which gives a kind of a view of how people react, but also how people rebuild after all of the damage that happens. I must add that it's incredibly difficult to find spatial justice in places that are at the moment in the epicenter of violence, like Gaza, like Lebanon. But I think with the distance, because this has happened in Iraq and it's been happening for years, but with a distance of 10 years from that, Iraq has started to build up and bring all of that aspect of. I put a few QR codes, but also a link to the project. There are two archives, one on the genocide project and one on the rupturing architecture project, which you can see all of the rest of the maps and other bits and pieces.
So thank you so much for our brilliant speakers. Now I would invite Musa to the table, and maybe if Sana and Omar can join us here. We're going to have just kind of quick reactions, questions for all the panelists, and then we're going to move to questions from the audience.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you for the 4 panelists for thought-provoking and I have to say heartbreaking presentations. I know all of you, or at least 2 of you, have made time to talk to us despite a significant hardship that living in or attending to a war zone entails. So thanks again, especially here. I have a couple of comments and questions to start the conversation. One, just hearing the accounts of all four of you of Urbicide from across the region, the East Mediterranean. What of course is clear from what you all said is one, that these are recurrent processes of destruction that leave their traces on the region's inhabitants for decades. You know, academia, at least in anthropology where I come from, sometimes we'll speak about the experience of violence and destruction as an event, as something that happens. And I think we know now it's not an event, it's something we live through, humans and cities. Throughout our lives, and sometimes even beyond, with the idea of intergenerational trauma coming to that. So, and I actually met Abir in 2006 war, and she worked on the reconstruction of some of the villages she's showing to be destructed again now. And so, besides this recurrent process, that they are region-wide across many cities. And I wonder if you can speak a bit more to considering these experiences collectively. You did say one pain, one struggle, but I don't know if, like, as this constellation of forms of war, if we can look at them comparatively as well as a little bit analytically in terms of the connections between these processes of destruction, not only in terms of their impact, but also maybe the driving forces behind them. And the impunity that the purpose, like none of, with all this landscape destruction, nobody was held accountable regardless of where they are. And sorry if I make a cheeky comment now, I wonder if somebody, a geographer, a mapper, could do a mapping of that destruction with, for example, a map of military, US military bases in the region and show us if there is some overlap. The other question, which I think the more important one, is what practices of resistance and life making continue to carve space through this debris, and how do cities resist these attempts to assassinate them, and in what way can we as scholars, as urbanists, architects, academics contribute to protecting these spaces and the life that these spaces entail from further destruction? What role there is now as we witness this ongoing genocide in Urbicide? Thank you again. I don't know, should we also open but do we want to have people reply to this, or do we also want to add questions? Yeah. Does anybody online want to start? Nurhan or Abir?
I can comment on, because you ask so many questions. So I first of all, I think we can have so many overlaps between all these cases of herbicide, and I think it is very true. One pain, one struggle is one pain. Now, the patterns of herbicide that we can see across the region is like, it is about the everyday life. It's about the home destruction, and the loss of home have a huge impact on people's, of course, collective memory. So if I can look at all the mapping that, in the case of Iraq, I did also mapping in Nablus city that was destroyed by the Israeli army in the invasions of 2002 during the second Intifada. Just comparing how much the kids are now perceiving their city only during these moments of destruction. They no longer have a memory of how the city looked like before destruction. So it's this connotation of destruction and the trauma that is accompanying this trauma and the experience will affect the collective memory for the generations to come. Of course, it's an extreme case now in Gaza. It's not the same as in other locations in the occupied territories. I'm not sure if my colleagues in Syria, from Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon can confirm this, but this is one, at least. I see that the trauma, the experience can be similar regardless of the context. Also, I compared the Bosnian case with the Palestinian case in my research. The second point I want to make is how people really react, or what kind of forms of resistance during still in these continuous episodes of destruction. For example, reconstruction is seen as an act of resistance in the Palestinian case. For us, to exist is to resist, because now the physical artifact is our testimony that this is also, we belong to this land and this culture, its landscape. So now I'm not talking about Gaza because it's still not finished, but at least in Nablus, people directly, without waiting for any public institute or government to take over the reconstruction activity, starting reconstructing and renovating their houses to keep continuing with their life, what we call sumud, steadfastness, as a form of resistance, commemoration as well as a form of resistance. I think also tunneling Gaza, the tunnels, building tunnels underground in Gaza is a form of resistance. Claiming spaces that now are under the Israeli military control, even it's for instant and very short time, just to claim that this is a Palestinian land is a form of resistance. What we are doing now here is a form of resistance, intellectual resistance, doing research, building up the Palestinian narrative that is absent in the mainstream media, even in academia, is a form of resistance. So I think we need to embrace all these forms of resistance, especially now in the post-war reconstruction strategies. The danger I am seeing now, if the World Bank or these types of international organizations and donors come with their money for the reconstruction of Gaza with their own political agenda, so that the people's identity, aspirations, and wishes will not be fulfilled in this process of reconstruction, because reconstruction for me is also a very important process for healing that should be taken into consideration. Thank you.
Javier, did you want to comment on this, or we take somebody from the
I will not go into some of the things that Nurhan said, because they're all extremely, they can be easily applied to the context of Lebanon and forms of solidarity that have been emerging, but also modes of resistance and so on. Maybe I just want to add, and this is coming from someone who's now experiencing the first month of the intensity of the Israeli attacks on Lebanon. I feel we need to reinvent our tools of resistance, because there's something extremely different happening this time. I mean, as Muzna said, I met her in the 2006 war, and it did feel like it was a war that had a beginning and an end. And we could imagine that there is a path for a post-war reconstruction. This time it feels extremely different. It feels like it's going to be an elongated, never-ending war. And it feels like there are two very different things that are very different from 2006 today in Lebanon. The first one is the technological power that the occupier has in terms of types of weaponry and types of tools and types of surveillance. This is something we are not used to. We haven't developed modes of facing it. And the second one is that this is coming at a time where the sort of the war on terrorism is taking shape and is at the forefront of what's happening. And I just think what I'm saying is that we feel as a society now that we really need to reinvent tools of resistance and also tools of surviving what looks to be like an extremely long war.
Thank you, Javier.
I'm just, yeah, I'm just going to add to what both Abir and Nurhan said to this continuous version of spatial violence that has been in that part of the world for centuries. Actually, the tactics that are used are incredibly similar. Yes, the technology is very much more profound now, but I do remember, because I lived through the Iraq-Iran war, and then the first Gulf War, and then the full-on 2003. Technology does make a huge difference to the trauma that leaves with you, but also to the tactics of war that happen. But I see exactly the same tactics that the IDF are used by, Nurhan mentioned the Fallujah attack, which basically decimated an entire city in Iraq by the US army. Exactly the same tactics used by ISIS in the north of Iraq on Mosul. So there are synergies in those ways of working that we can absolutely look at it. And I'm not going to, we're definitely not going to be able to map the locations of military bases for various reasons. Definitely not a brown person doing that job. But the idea of the resistance and the types of resistance that are coming out are also transcending borders. I remember when the 2019 revolution happened in Iraq, it was already happening in Beirut. And there were people talking to each other over social media from both sides of the kind of the path. And I also remember it when it happened in 2011 in Syria, and there was a lot of solidarity across borders. So there is also a different way of responding that is happening, and that is really interesting to see. As scholars, well, you are all, everyone who's been part of this panel is referenced in my book, and I made an intentional move to actually amplify the voices of scholars who are from that part of the world, who are struggling to also exist within a colonial knowledge creation kind of world. So there is a lot on us writing as people who have left and potentially could do more. And we've had several discussions, Ammar and I, on our responsibility as scholars in that space.
You want to? Yeah,
So we're going to have a space for a few questions. Ask you to please be very brief, introduce yourself, be very brief, have a question more than a comment. And I will take few of the questions, and then we will bring it back to the panelists.
Thank you all to the panel. Thank you for your scholarship and for sharing. My question comes from some of the statements, say, with regards to mapping the basis or the touching on the homo-nationalism as a guise to destroy these cities, or the mapping from the visualizing Palestine of this kind of commercial mention. Ahmad has talked a lot about the commercial interest that comes with this, that I think, and when you speak to the responsibility, I think, what is our role? Because there is a goal that comes to this. I think to like the Sasaki project in Afghanistan, which was a commercialized venture. So it really is, how does that come into this? I know, Amal, you can speak to it, and looking at, where does the destruction lead to a profit for others?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I'm not sure if it was, I can say good, but definitely disturbing as well. So my question sort of ties to what you just reflected upon, on looking at these ideas beyond borders. And also you mentioned sort of the idea of how people sort of express solidarity beyond borders. So how do you situate the idea of Urbicide beyond borders within the larger geopolitical context, as these historical fault lines are also over territories with abundance of resources that sustain the global markets of all forms? And when I say these fault lines, these are not just the ones in Middle East, but all around the world. If we talk about Kashmir, which is in the northern part of India, that sort of separates India and Pakistan, and even the northeastern part of India and Myanmar borders have been extremely conflicted territories as well, which people and the mainstream media sort of chooses to conveniently overlook. And having said that, Middle East also has 2/3 of world's oil reserves. So how do you look at all of these dynamics? And second follow-up question of the same idea is how do you reflect from your on-ground research on local community groups and politics, not the NGOized groups? Thank you.
We can take one more and then we respond. I think there's one. We have already several questions online, so we are just going to take the response and then.
As academics and scholars, what advice can you give us students that want to give back or have a little something to provide? I'm doing architecture, for example, but how can we do anything?
I think briefly, advice for students to maybe not to be very harsh on yourself at the start all the time, because everyone has their own tools and devices to use, and I think it's important to know to do what we can do. Maybe it could be a reading list that you create, maybe it could be knowledge production. In terms of like struggles beyond solidarity beyond boundaries and borders, and I think if you see what's happening, for instance, in India or China, there's so much destruction of people's homes that goes underreported. But also, if you see the destruction of Ukraine, for instance, and Genia is with us here, who's the writer of Being a Ukrainian Architect at the Time of War, we can see this sense of, we're all connected with this grief and struggle. But sometimes the media would look at a conflict as a fashionable conflict, and others go underreported. So, for instance, like Kashmir, like it's slow in the making violence. And I think it's important to unpack these questions of violence in peace and war and connect them globally. And I think like Max's question about turning people's pain into an opportunity or into a struggle. I remember once I spoke to a Syrian scholar who told me reconstruction is like a cake. Everyone wants a piece of it except the locals who are left without any piece of it. And I think I always remember this example on how do you try to work on a vulnerable setting without causing more damage to the local people, and how can you work on a setting of displacement or destruction in a way that you can respect the dignity and the rights and the identity of those people we are supposed to be working with.
Nurhan or
Yeah.
Abir,
I can also elaborate on some of these questions. What can we do? We can do a lot. First of all, we need to decolonize knowledge. This is really my call. All the knowledge that we are now using is really in the Western academia is based and so much rooted in the colonial history. And it is actually was established, most of it, to justify colonialism as a good thing. It was meant to civilize these uncivilized people in the colonies. So this is the first step to do. Second, I think we can also do is boycott academia, the Israeli academia. Boycott is a very important pressure tool, especially for us. I think from moral perspective and ethical perspective, we need to highlight that the Israeli academia is so much involved in the Israeli colonial project in Palestine since its start. So there's a recent book written on very explicitly saying and highlighting how the Israeli academia and universities not only developing research on the high technology for the war machine, but how much the theories and the tools that we use as architects and urbanists are now used in the Israeli military training so that they understand how cities function to be able to control them. For example, I will mention one example for Arnon Sofer from Haifa University. He's a sociologist. He was the one who laid the detailed plans for the isolation of Gaza directly to the Prime Minister Ariel Sharon in 2004. This tactic of walking through walls that you explained very nicely in Iraq is not a new tactic. It was used in Jaffa during the British Mandate in the 40s and was later developed by the Israeli military academia. And I think Eyal Weizman explains it very how the Israeli army is now using this inverted geometry theory. It's really from architectural philosophy to invade cities and control them from within. So this is just two examples of how much the Israeli academia is involved in the colonial apparatus in occupied Palestine. So these are the two holes I have. Decolonized knowledge. We need also to bring the knowledge from other non-Western context to be able to work on sustainability, circularity, social justice. We need to have our own tools. We need to build up our own narrative so that we can have control. If we always import the knowledge from the Western, actually Western knowledge that is based in colonialism, we are even enforcing more colonialism in our countries. So these are my two codes.
Shall we move to the online questions because we got several, so perhaps we can also share some of the questions, get them together and see how can we cluster.
I share maybe two from the online. There are a couple of questions on reconstruction. So from Roger, he asks, further to the horrific scenes of destruction we have seen, do any of the speakers have any estimates to how long the task of reconstruction might take and how much it might cost? And in a related way, there is from Martina. She says, thank you for the inspiration and the heartbreaking words. She says there is a lot of academic research going on. At the same time, there's a lot of action from the side of private developers, which continues that conversation. I don't know if her question was answered. Assigned infrastructure and housing reconstruction projects encouraged by the local or colonizer governments with funding even before conflict is over. So if you want to elaborate on this, how do you think academic research can interfere in that process for a more just and inclusive urban reconstruction? And a third question, probably that pertains more to Nurhan, if we see any evidence of infrastructure being erected to limit access to returning people, particularly around access to the sea and the gas and oil fields. In other words, they say, do you agree this may be a permanent land clearance with military and strategic aims, including in Syria, Lebanon, and Gaza?
I'm just going to take the question on reconstruction. Reconstruction is not linear, and it never was, and it never going to be. post-war in particular is even more complex. But I think it connects back to a question from the audience we had. Reconstruction happens from within, and it doesn't happen with imposed, through imposed companies that come from the West. And I know that especially in Iraq, millions and millions of pounds and dollars were spent on individual buildings because they're World Heritage Sites and because they were on the UNESCO heritage sites. Meanwhile, the destruction of Mosul continued to be that way for years after the rebuilding of one minaret. And I'm not saying that the minaret does not deserve the reconstruction, but the actual amount of money that was USAID spent, a report just came out, just in the north of Iraq, over $300 million were spent in that part of the world, and not a penny went to the people who are still in camps. So there is a lot that happens after a collapse of a regime, which is what happened in Iraq, where not only lawlessness, but also there is no one political party dominating a conversation. There are so many, and there is also an incredible amount of corruption, which also doesn't help in the rebuilding. So out of the over 4.5 million homes necessary to be rebuilt after the war, nothing has actually materialized, because the minute some kind of villages start to revive, something big happens, and then more destruction happens in those areas. So because it's a non-linear, it's incredibly difficult to manufacture. The only way it works is through grassroots organizations, which is what I've intend to work with, and I have worked with in Iraq. I don't work with big organizations because they don't really do much to the people. And the only reason why I did with IOM in that last project is because they control the camps in the north of Iraq. That's the only reason.
Nurhan just shared something, so maybe we can go to Perry.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to answer diverse questions by just showing this image. This is how Netanyahu imagined Gaza in 1935. This tells you a lot about the Israeli intentions and plans for Gaza, just clearing the land to establish the new Dubai, so that the Israeli investment can flourish on the rubbles of Gaza. So this is also just a proof that now the clearance of land that is taking place now in the northern part of Gaza, the starvation, and how this massive destruction is meant to squeeze as many people as possible to the south and use the chance to rebuild Gaza to be the new Dubai. But I totally agree with Sana. I think we shouldn't wait for the Western or donors to take over, like the World Bank, to take over the reconstruction. But we need also to empower the local community. Now they are grieving, and they are like subject to all this tremendous trauma. I think we as an academics, architects, I think activists, we can inspire them. We can think along with them on how this reconstruction can take place, not on this tremendous scale, but in small scale, by empowering them with the designs, tools, tactics, like this place making or city making. So in the waiting for this, process to be launched on a large scale, there are some estimates that we need 40 to 50 years to reconstruct Gaza with billions of euros. So it's a long-term process. And most importantly, we cannot do that without having free Palestine.
And I think this is a great closure. Apologies to the people online that we couldn't go through all the questions, but we started a bit late and we are already experiencing some exit from the room. I wonder if you want to say anything else, like a final thought, but I think it's been very important to have you here and have all, the attention of people. And we hopefully will have some follow-up events given, kind of the relevance of it. So stay tuned. We are gonna try to make available, all the information. If you see, we can have this online for the ones that are not able to join us and to share and spread the word. For the ones that are interested, there's a group about boycott, divestment and divestment in UCL. So look up for that or drop us a line if you're interested. We are still looking for people to pledge what has been proposed there. So thank you very much, and hopefully we will see and meet very soon. Thank you so much.